Most people think history changes with explosions, with revolutions, with dramatic moments that divide time into before and after. But that is not how history usually works. Most of the time, history changes quietly. So quietly that people living through it don't even realize anything has changed at all. Empires don't always fall. Sometimes they just get tired. Tired of reform. Tired of resistance. Tired of trying to fix problems that never fully disappear. Power doesn't vanish overnight. It thins. Authority doesn't collapse. It becomes routine. People stop asking what could be better, and start asking what can stay the same. This is the kind of history you never see in movies. No heroes. No final battles. No clear ending. Just paperwork. Habits. Delays. And decisions that slowly stop mattering. Over years, sometimes decades, institutions continue to exist, but they no longer guide the future. They manage the present. Barely. Rules are followed not because they are believed in, but because they are familiar. Change becomes risky. Stability becomes valuable. And survival becomes the only real goal. This is the story of how societies learn to accept decline without ever calling it decline. How boredom becomes political. How fatigue becomes power. And how time, more than force, prepares people for whatever comes next. This is not the history of collapse. This is the history of waiting. And once you understand this kind of history, you start seeing it everywhere. History rarely announces itself. It does not arrive with sound or spectacle. Most of the time, it moves slowly, almost politely, asking for very little attention. People living through long decline rarely describe it as decline. They describe it as normal, as life, as the way things have always been. Institutions continue to exist. Offices open in the morning. Documents are signed. Orders are issued. But the meaning behind these actions changes quietly. Authority becomes procedural. Power shifts from direction to maintenance. The future is no longer shaped. It is postponed. This is how slow history works. At first, nothing feels wrong. Reforms are discussed. Committees are formed. Reports are written. Each problem is acknowledged, but never fully resolved. Temporary solutions become permanent habits. Delays become policy. Exceptions become routine. People adapt without realizing they are adapting. They lower expectations. They learn which rules matter and which ones exist only on paper. They learn when to speak and when silence is safer. This adaptation is not weakness. It is survival. As coordination weakens, responsibility fragments. No single decision appears decisive enough to change direction. Every action is justified as necessary under the circumstances. The circumstances, however, never change. Economic life adjusts first. Investment becomes cautious. Innovation slows. Short-term stability is valued more than long-term growth. Merchants learn flexibility. Workers learn versatility. Everyone learns restraint. Risk becomes personal. Failure is absorbed individually. Success is temporary. Education expands, but opportunity does not keep pace. Knowledge increases faster than mobility. This creates quiet frustration. Controlled, internalized, rarely expressed. People become skilled at waiting. Waiting for permission. Waiting for clarity. Waiting for change that never fully arrives. Political language shifts accordingly. Stability becomes the highest virtue. Order replaces vision. Continuity is praised more than progress. Disruption is framed as danger. Uncertainty is treated as threat. Predictability becomes moral. These ideas are not imposed suddenly. They grow naturally from experience. When instability lasts long enough, even flawed order feels preferable. Administration fills the space once occupied by leadership. Systems learn to preserve themselves. Survival becomes success. Meetings continue. Reports multiply. Decisions circulate without consequence. From the outside, the system looks intact. From the inside, it feels hollow. Foreign observers often misread this condition. They see continuity and assume strength. They see compliance and assume agreement. Influence is applied gradually. Pressure is unnecessary. Time does the work. Local authority grows quietly. Interpretation matters more than instruction. Enforcement becomes selective. People adjust their behavior to these realities. They stop asking what is fair. They ask what is safe. Social trust narrows. Long-term cooperation becomes difficult. Short-term alignment dominates. Networks replace institutions. Relationships replace rules. This keeps life functioning, but it weakens structure. Cultural expression adapts as well. Direct criticism fades. Subtlety becomes essential. Ambiguity becomes protection. Art does not challenge openly. It observes. It hints. It survives. The population becomes deeply experienced but quietly exhausted. Not emotionally dramatic exhaustion, administrative fatigue, social fatigue, historical fatigue. This fatigue does not lead immediately to resistance. It leads to acceptance. Acceptance is misunderstood. It is not approval. It is adjustment. Over time, this adjustment reshapes collective psychology. People learn that endurance matters more than participation. That stability matters more than influence. The future becomes abstract. The present becomes everything. History textbooks later describe this period as a prelude. But for those living through it, it feels endless. Years blend together. Changes are incremental. Nothing appears decisive. This is how long decline prepares the ground. Not through persuasion. Through repetition. By the time decisive authority emerges, society has already been trained. Trained to comply. Trained to adapt. Trained to endure. Not because people want control, but because they want predictability. This is the history that rarely gets told. Because it is quiet. Because it is boring. And because it explains more than battles ever could. Over time. The habit of endurance reshapes how people think about responsibility. Problems are no longer framed as things to be solved, but as conditions to be managed. The question stops being, how do we fix this? It becomes, how do we live with this? This shift is subtle. It happens without announcement. Language adjusts first. Words like reform and progress remain in use, but their meaning thins. They refer to maintenance rather than transformation. To adjustment rather than change. Institutions respond accordingly. They refine procedures. They add layers of review. They create systems designed to prevent disruption rather than produce outcomes. Efficiency becomes less important than predictability. Speed is sacrificed for caution. Responsibility is distributed until it becomes difficult to locate. When outcomes disappoint, no single decision appears responsible. Failure dissolves into process. This diffusion of responsibility is not accidental. It is a defensive adaptation. Systems learn to protect themselves by avoiding decisive action. People working inside these systems are not indifferent. They are constrained. They learn that initiative carries risk, while compliance carries safety. So initiative fades. The rhythm of daily life adjusts around this reality. People plan shorter horizons. They avoid dependence on promises. They value what is immediately verifiable. Trust becomes conditional. Commitment becomes reversible. Economic behavior follows the same pattern. Long-term investment declines. Short-term opportunity dominates. Assets are chosen for liquidity, not growth. Stability is pursued privately, not collectively. This private pursuit weakens public capacity, but it feels rational to individuals. Everyone adapts separately. Coordination becomes rare not because people oppose it, but because it requires trust. Trust is expensive in uncertain environments. Education continues to expand awareness. People know more about how other societies function. They understand alternatives. But understanding does not equal access. This gap produces a quiet tension, not explosive anger, but low-grade dissatisfaction. Dissatisfaction without outlet turns inward. People adjust expectations downward. They redefine success as survival. Generational change does not break this cycle immediately. New generations inherit habits before they inherit power. They learn caution before authority. What was once adaptation becomes culture. Culture is powerful because it does not feel imposed. It feels natural. It feels reasonable. This is how decline sustains itself without force. Administrative routines become rituals. They signal continuity even when effectiveness declines. Symbols remain intact. Substance erodes quietly. Foreign influence continues to operate within this environment. External actors do not need to dominate openly. They align incentives. They wait. Time favors those who can afford patience. Local authority grows more confident. Not ideologically, but practically. Decision-making moves closer to daily reality. Central coordination weakens further. This fragmentation is not chaos. It is functional disunity. Life goes on. That is what makes it dangerous to notice. People confuse survival with stability. They confuse routine with order. They confuse endurance with strength. History later calls this period inevitable. But inevitability is only visible in retrospect. From within, it feels manageable. Until it doesn't. The system continues to thin, not collapsing, just losing density. Density matters. It provides resistance. It absorbs shock. It enables recovery. When density is lost, systems remain standing but become brittle. Brittleness is invisible until tested. Political narratives adjust again. They emphasize unity without integration, strength without capacity, order without coordination. These narratives resonate because they align with experience. People want reassurance, not explanation. Explanation requires complexity. Complexity feels risky. Simple messages gain power in fatigued societies. Not because they are accurate, but because they reduce uncertainty. The long decline simplifies demand. People ask for fewer things, but they ask for them consistently. They want rules that are clear, authority that is decisive, outcomes that are predictable. Participation becomes secondary. Debate becomes exhausting. This does not mean people abandon thought. They abandon expectation. Expectation is costly when repeatedly disappointed. So society adapts again. It accepts limitation as reality. It adjusts behavior accordingly. This adjustment prepares the ground for concentration of power. Not because people desire control, but because they desire relief from ambiguity. Ambiguity is exhausting. When authority promises clarity, it gains attention. When it promises order, it gains tolerance. When it promises stability, it gains time. Time is enough. History often treats the emergence of decisive authority as abrupt. In reality, it is gradual. It advances into spaces already cleared by fatigue. Opposition exists, but it is fragmented. Coordination is difficult. Trust is thin. Resistance requires energy. Energy is scarce after long decline. This is how boring history shapes outcomes. Not through persuasion. Through depletion. Depletion of trust. Depletion of expectation. Depletion of patience. By the time the system changes direction, the population has already changed with it. They do not celebrate transformation. They tolerate it. Tolerance is sufficient. This is the second act of long decline. Not collapse, but readiness. Readiness without enthusiasm. Acceptance without conviction. The quiet preparation continues. As readiness settles in, society begins to rearrange its sense of responsibility. People stop asking who should act and start asking who will act. This subtle shift changes everything. Collective obligation weakens. Individual calculation strengthens. Each decision is weighed against risk, not principle. Public systems continue to function. But they do so on borrowed trust. Trust accumulated in the past is spent gradually. It is not replenished. Meetings still occur. Policies are still announced. But implementation depends increasingly on informal agreement rather than formal authority. This informality creates flexibility. It also creates inequality. Outcomes vary by location, by relationship, by timing. People learn this quickly. They adjust behavior. They invest in proximity rather than process. They seek access rather than accountability. Access replaces rights. Knowing someone matters more than knowing the rules. This does not feel corrupt to those living within it. It feels practical. It feels necessary. Over time, necessity becomes justification. The system's memory lengthens while its vision shortens. It remembers what worked yesterday. It avoids imagining tomorrow. Planning becomes reactive. Strategy becomes maintenance. Economic patterns reflect this shift. Growth is uneven. Development clusters where enforcement is predictable. Elsewhere, stagnation persists. Markets function. They simply stop expanding. Labor adapts by diversifying skills rather than deepening them. Versatility protects against volatility. Specialization feels dangerous. Careers become paths of adjustment rather than progression. Education continues to promise opportunity. But opportunity remains conditional. Merit exists, but it competes with proximity. This creates a quiet contradiction. People are told that knowledge matters. Experience teaches that alignment matters more. The contradiction is not resolved. It is absorbed. Absorption is a key feature of long decline. Contradictions do not explode. They are internalized. Political participation changes character. It becomes symbolic rather than influential. Voting, attendance, and expression continue. But expectation fades. People participate because it is expected, not because they expect results. This hollow participation maintains legitimacy on the surface. It reduces pressure beneath. Foreign actors interpret this as stability. They misread endurance as consent. They misread silence as agreement. Influence deepens quietly. Dependency grows without resistance. Not because resistance is impossible, but because coordination is costly. Coordination requires trust. Trust requires consistency. Consistency has been absent for too long. Local authorities fill the gap. They manage expectations. They mediate pressure. They translate central directives into workable routines. This translation is power. Power shifts from rule-making to interpretation. From law to discretion. Discretion is flexible. It is also unaccountable. People accept this trade-off because it produces predictability. Predictability is relief. Relief becomes loyalty. Cultural narratives adapt again. Stories emphasize endurance. Survival becomes virtue. Stability becomes morality. These narratives do not feel imposed. They feel earned through experience. The past is reframed. Periods of order are remembered positively. Periods of uncertainty are remembered negatively. Complexity is forgotten. Structure is remembered. This selective memory shapes demand. People want authority that feels firm. They want rules that feel clear. They want outcomes that feel reliable. They are willing to trade participation for predictability. This trade is rarely explicit. It emerges gradually. Administrative systems respond. They centralize decision-making to reduce variance. They simplify messaging. They prioritize compliance over consensus. Compliance is easier to measure. Consensus is difficult to maintain. The cost of dissent increases subtly, not through punishment, but through inconvenience. Access becomes harder. Opportunities narrow. People adapt again. They self-regulate. They anticipate boundaries. They avoid friction. Avoidance becomes intelligence. This intelligence spreads socially. Children learn caution early. Ambition is moderated. Expectation is restrained. The long decline trains this behavior across generations. History later describes these moments as turning points. But from within, they feel like adjustments. Nothing changes all at once. Everything changes enough. This incremental change is difficult to resist. Each step feels tolerable. No single moment demands action. This is how concentration of authority becomes possible. Not through force, but through accommodation. Accommodation feels reasonable when alternatives feel risky. Risk has been punished for too long. As authority consolidates, it promises efficiency. It promises clarity. It promises to reduce uncertainty. These promises resonate. People do not ask whether power should concentrate. They ask whether it will finally work. Work, in this context, means consistency. The bar has lowered. This lowering is the real legacy of long decline. Not loss of freedom, but loss of expectation. Expectation is heavy. It demands delivery. When expectation disappears, tolerance increases. Tolerance allows time. Time allows consolidation. Opposition exists, but it is cautious, fragmented, exhausted. Resistance requires hope. Hope requires evidence. Evidence has been scarce. So the system moves forward, not on enthusiasm, but on resignation. Resignation is stable. It does not mobilize crowds. It does not inspire slogans. It permits change by not obstructing it. This is the third act of boring history. Not decay, not collapse, but alignment. Alignment between fatigue and authority. Between expectation and limitation. The groundwork is nearly complete. The society that emerges from this period is not unaware. It is realistic. Realistic about cost. Realistic about risk. Realistic about power. This realism is often mistaken for maturity. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it is simply exhaustion refined. History does not judge this distinction kindly or harshly. It records outcomes. And outcomes follow preparation. Preparation, in this case, took decades. It required no speeches. It required no battles. Only time. Time changes how people measure success. Victory is no longer improvement. Victory is avoidance. Avoiding loss. Avoiding attention. Avoiding responsibility that cannot be fulfilled. Institutions learn this lesson first. They stop promising outcomes. They start promising processes. Processes are safer. They can be repeated without evaluation. Failure becomes procedural, not personal. When outcomes disappoint, explanations multiply. Context is cited. Constraints are emphasized. Complexity is invoked. No one is wrong. Everyone is limited. This language spreads downward. Managers speak it. Teachers use it. Media normalizes it. Language shapes expectation. Expectation shapes tolerance. Over time, tolerance expands beyond intention. People accept delays that once felt unacceptable. They accept explanations that once felt insufficient. Patience becomes cultural. Urgency feels immature. This shift affects innovation. Innovation requires impatience. It requires dissatisfaction with present conditions. But dissatisfaction is framed as instability. Instability is framed as risk. Risk is discouraged. So innovation becomes cosmetic. Design changes. Terminology updates. Underlying structures remain intact. Reform replaces transformation. Reform is controllable. Transformation is not. The system becomes very good at reform. It reforms repeatedly. It reforms endlessly. Each reform signals responsiveness. None alter direction. This creates a peculiar sense of motion without movement. Activity without progress. Change without consequence. People feel busy. They do not feel hopeful. Hope is dangerous in this environment. It creates expectation. Expectation creates disappointment. Disappointment demands accountability. So hope is softened, rebranded as realism, packaged as patience. Patience becomes virtue. Those who demand faster change are labeled reckless. Those who resist are labeled disruptive. Social pressure replaces enforcement. The public learns which questions are welcome, which topics lead nowhere, which criticisms carry cost. This learning is quiet. It does not feel like suppression. It feels like social intelligence. Knowing when to speak. Knowing when to wait. Waiting becomes a skill. Entire generations grow fluent in waiting. Waiting for approval. Waiting for opportunity. Waiting for conditions to improve. The future is always slightly postponed. Just far enough to remain believable. Economic life adapts again. People reduce dependency on formal promises. They build parallel strategies, side incomes, informal networks, personal contingencies. Security becomes private. Public systems remain symbolic. This privatization of security weakens collective leverage. People cannot risk disruption. They have too much to manage individually. Collective action declines not from apathy, but from calculation. Calculation favors survival over change. Political narratives shift once more. Leaders speak less about vision, more about stability. Stability becomes the highest value. Above justice. Above efficiency. Above growth. Because instability threatens what little predictability remains. Foreign observers see calm. They assume confidence. They do not see the cost of maintaining calm. Calm requires constant adjustment, constant compromise, constant delay. It is exhausting. Exhaustion does not look dramatic. It looks quiet. It looks orderly. Order becomes the final achievement. But order without direction slowly hollows itself. Rules multiply to preserve consistency. Exceptions multiply to preserve functionality. The gap between rule and reality widens. Bridges form in that gap. Middlemen, interpreters, fixers. These actors gain influence. Not through authority, but through necessity. Necessity creates loyalty. Loyalty creates power. This power is rarely visible. It operates between systems. It thrives in ambiguity. Formal leadership tolerates it, sometimes relies on it, sometimes fears it, but dismantling it would disrupt order. So it remains. At this stage, decline is no longer debated. It is assumed. Conversation shifts from prevention to management. How to slow it, how to soften it, how to live within it. This acceptance marks a threshold. Beyond it, reversal becomes unlikely, not impossible, but improbable, because reversal demands belief. Belief demands imagination. Imagination has been trained out. Education reflects this too. Critical thinking is encouraged, but bounded. Students learn to analyze systems, not to challenge their purpose. They learn how things work, not why they exist. Why is dangerous? Why invites alternatives? Alternatives invite instability. So curiosity narrows. The society remains intelligent, skilled, capable, but directionless. Direction requires consensus. Consensus requires shared aspiration. Aspiration has dissolved into individual planning. The collective future becomes abstract. Personal futures become detailed. This imbalance shapes everything that follows. History later labels this period transitional. From what to what is debated. But within the moment, it feels permanent. People stop waiting for change. They start waiting for adjustment. Adjustment is manageable. Change is not. And so the system continues. Not because it is strong, but because it is familiar. Familiarity outlasts optimism. It outlasts frustration. It outlasts critique. Until something external intervenes. Or something internal finally breaks. But breaking is rare. More often, things simply drift. Drift is the final form of boring history. Not collapse. Not triumph. Just continuation. And continuation, over enough time, becomes destiny. Drift does not announce itself. It accumulates. Small decisions made for convenience begin to shape outcomes meant for principle. Temporary measures become permanent fixtures. Exceptions harden into norms. What was once tolerated becomes expected. What was once questioned becomes ignored. This is how time edits values without asking permission. Generational transition accelerates this process. Those who remember alternatives age out of influence. Those who inherit the system know only its current shape. They do not feel loss. They feel reality. Stories of how things used to work sound exaggerated. Complaints feel nostalgic. Warnings feel abstract. Memory weakens. Context disappears. The system benefits from this forgetting. It no longer needs to justify its evolution. It simply exists. Education focuses on adaptation, not transformation. Students learn how to navigate complexity, not simplify it. Navigation replaces direction. Young professionals enter institutions already fluent in caution. They observe first. They wait. They align. Alignment is rewarded. Originality is tolerated only if it does not disrupt. This creates a talent profile optimized for maintenance. Competent, flexible, unthreatening. Ambition survives, but it is inward. Personal advancement over collective reform. The cost of pushing against structure is visible. The benefit is uncertain. So pressure dissipates. Media adapts too. Coverage emphasizes process over consequence. Debate becomes technical. Language becomes neutral. Neutrality sounds responsible. It also drains urgency. Problems are framed as challenges. Failures as lessons. Delays as complexities. Emotion is moderated. Outrage is discouraged. Fatigue is normalized. The public learns to consume information without expectation of resolution. This consumption is passive but informed. People know what is happening. They simply do not believe they can alter it. Belief is the missing variable. Foreign pressure increases gradually. Economic leverage. Cultural influence. Strategic dependency. None are decisive alone. Together, they shape constraint. Policy choices narrow. Options shrink. Leaders speak of pragmatism. Pragmatism becomes justification. Ideals are referenced ceremonially. They remain in speeches, not in strategy. Symbols persist. Rituals continue. The appearance of continuity masks the absence of momentum. At this stage, crisis becomes the only catalyst capable of change. But crisis must be unmistakable. Ambiguous crises are absorbed. Small shocks strengthen existing patterns. They justify control. They reward familiarity. Only sustained disruption can alter direction. But sustained disruption requires coordination. Coordination requires trust. Trust has been fragmented. Communities retreat into smaller units. Professional networks. Cultural circles. Digital spaces. Consensus fractures along lines of experience rather than ideology. Everyone sees a different problem. No one sees the whole. This fragmentation protects the system. Opposition cannot unify. Attempts to mobilize feel forced. They lack shared language. They dissolve. The system interprets this as legitimacy. Legitimacy, once earned, now assumed. Time passes. Budgets tighten. Infrastructure ages. Maintenance replaces investment. The future is postponed again. People adjust expectations downward once more. They redefine success as continuity. Failure as disruption. Disruption becomes feared. This fear is rational. Lives have become delicately balanced. Any shock threatens multiple dependencies. So stability is protected, even when it no longer serves growth. This protection is not enforced. It is volunteered. Voluntary compliance is the strongest form. History rarely notes this moment. There is no decree, no turning point, just a quiet agreement not to push too hard. The society still functions. It still produces. It still governs. But it no longer imagines. Imagination is replaced by scenario planning. Scenarios assume limits. They do not challenge them. This is the ceiling effect of long decline. Progress occurs within boundaries that never expand. People grow skilled at optimizing within constraint. They become excellent managers of insufficiency. This skill is admired. It is rewarded. Eventually, it defines competence itself. At this point, decline is not visible as loss. It is visible as narrowing. Narrower choices. Narrower ambition. Narrower tolerance for uncertainty. The world outside continues to change. Faster, more decisively. The gap widens. But within the system, the pace feels normal. Normal is the most dangerous illusion of all. Because normal convinces people nothing urgent is happening. And urgency is the only force that interrupts drift. Without it, time continues its work. Quietly, patiently, until what once felt permanent begins to feel fragile. Not broken, just thin. And thin things do not shatter. They tear. Slowly. Thin systems fail differently than broken ones. They do not collapse. They stretch. Pressure builds unevenly. Some areas absorb more strain. Others are protected. This imbalance creates visible contrasts. Zones of efficiency beside zones of neglect. Modern language beside outdated practice. People notice, but they normalize it. Inequality is explained as complexity. Complexity excuses delay. The system responds by prioritizing optics. Visible success matters more than distributed improvement. Flagship projects replace foundational repair. These projects reassure. They signal capacity. They distract from fragility. Attention moves toward symbols of progress, metrics that can be displayed, milestones that can be announced. What cannot be measured is deferred. What cannot be announced is ignored. Institutions become performance aware. They learn how to look functional under strain. They optimize appearance. This is not deception. It is adaptation. Adaptation favors short-term survival over long-term resilience. Resilience requires investment without immediate return. Return is demanded now. Time horizons shorten again. As horizons shrink, decision-making becomes reactive. Leaders respond to signals, not trends. They manage moments. Moments pass. Trends continue. The public senses dissonance. Announcements feel disconnected from experience. Language drifts away from reality. Trust erodes further. Not through scandal, but through mismatch. Mismatch is corrosive. It teaches people to discount words. Words still matter ceremonially. They matter less practically. Action moves into informal space. Informal systems expand quietly. Workarounds become standard. Personal judgment fills structural gaps. This flexibility keeps things moving. It also decentralizes responsibility. When something fails, no single cause exists. Blame diffuses. Diffusion protects authority. It frustrates accountability. People adapt emotionally too. They lower emotional investment. Disappointment is managed preemptively. Cynicism is not loud. It is practical. Sarcasm replaces outrage. Humor replaces protest. This emotional shift stabilizes the system. Anger mobilizes. Cynicism dissipates. The culture becomes ironic. Distance is maintained from ideals. Commitment feels naive. Naivety is penalized socially. Realism is rewarded. Realism, in this context, means accepting limits. Limits are rarely defined explicitly. They are learned experientially. Push too far, and friction appears. People learn where friction lies. They stay just inside it. This collective calibration creates equilibrium. Equilibrium feels safe. It also prevents momentum. External comparison becomes uncomfortable. Other systems appear to move faster. To decide more clearly, this comparison produces defensiveness. Differences are emphasized. Context is invoked. Our situation is unique. Our constraints are different. These statements are true. They are also immobilizing. Uniqueness justifies stagnation. Over time, ambition reframes itself. Instead of catching up, the goal becomes not falling behind too quickly. Relative decline replaces absolute failure. This shift is subtle but decisive. Policy reflects it. Targets are revised downward. Expectations recalibrated. Success becomes survival. Survival becomes identity. Once identity forms around endurance, change feels like betrayal. Those who propose bold alternatives are seen as destabilizing, even threatening. Not because they are wrong, but because they disrupt coping mechanisms. Coping has become collective. Generational fatigue deepens. Young people inherit systems optimized for maintenance. They are taught competence, not vision. Vision feels irresponsible. They plan cautiously. They hedge. They diversify risk. Risk aversion becomes rational. This rationality shapes leadership pipelines. Those who rise are those who do not alarm. Those who reassure. Reassurance becomes the primary qualification. Charisma fades. Predictability dominates. This predictability slows response further. By now, decline is embedded. It no longer feels like a phase. It feels like climate. You do not argue with climate. You adapt to it. Adaptation becomes the highest skill. History later will debate when reversal was still possible. Analysts will point to data, to missed opportunities. But lived experience does not feel like opportunity. It feels like constraint. Constraint narrows imagination. Without imagination, alternatives cannot be sustained. At this point, only two forces remain capable of interruption: a shock large enough to override adaptation, or a generational rupture that redefines risk. Until then, continuation persists. The system holds. Thin, flexible, tired, still functioning, still managing, still waiting. Waiting for what is unclear. But waiting itself has become normal. And when waiting becomes normal, history slows to a near standstill. Not frozen, just moving too slowly to notice. Eventually, waiting encounters friction. Not dramatic resistance, just accumulation. Maintenance backlogs grow. Deferred decisions compound. Small inefficiencies stack into visible drag. The system still functions, but it requires more effort to produce the same results. People feel this as tiredness. Processes take longer. Responses slow. Approvals multiply. Nothing is officially wrong. Everything is slightly delayed. Delay becomes the dominant experience. Delay reshapes behavior again. People plan earlier. They buffer expectations. They over-prepare. Over-preparation consumes energy. Energy once spent on improvement is now spent on anticipation. Anticipation replaces initiative. Institutions mirror this behavior. They add layers to prevent surprise. They consult more. They verify repeatedly. Verification feels responsible. It also slows movement. Speed becomes suspicious. Decisiveness is questioned. Caution is praised. This environment rewards those who manage uncertainty, not those who reduce it. Uncertainty becomes permanent. Permanent uncertainty changes how people relate to authority. They stop expecting solutions. They expect management. Management is acceptable. Solutions are unrealistic. This lowers the emotional stakes of governance. Disappointment becomes routine. Outrage fades completely. What remains is endurance. Endurance has a rhythm. Work, wait, adjust, repeat. This rhythm becomes cultural. Music slows. Stories lengthen. Narratives emphasize persistence over victory. Even ambition adopts this tone. Success is described as longevity. Careers are judged by stability. Risk takers exist, but they operate at the margins. They are admired abstractly, not imitated. Imitation would require exposure. Exposure feels dangerous. So innovation externalizes. It happens elsewhere. It arrives later. Importing solutions becomes preferable to developing them internally. Dependency deepens again. Dependency is framed as cooperation. Cooperation is framed as pragmatism. Language continues to soften consequence. As dependency grows, leverage shrinks. Choices narrow further. But narrowing has become expected. Few notice. Generational turnover completes another cycle. New leaders inherit constraint as normal. They do not mourn what they never knew. Their reforms are technical, incremental, carefully bounded. They do not promise renewal. They promise reliability. Reliability feels comforting. It also locks direction. By now, the system's greatest achievement is that it has avoided collapse. Avoidance becomes success. This success is fragile. It depends on continued patience, on continued adjustment, on continued belief that nothing else is possible. Belief is quiet but powerful. As long as people believe alternatives are unrealistic, the present sustains itself. History records long stretches like this as stable periods. Stability, however, is descriptive, not predictive. Stability can persist right up until it cannot. The transition rarely announces itself. It begins with small misalignments that no longer self-correct. A response arrives too late. A resource fails to replenish. A dependency falters. At first, the system compensates. It always has. But compensation requires slack. Slack has been consumed. When slack disappears, errors stop cancelling out. They accumulate. Accumulation introduces a new sensation: uncertainty with consequence. For the first time in a long while, adjustment does not fully restore balance. People feel this shift before they name it. Confidence thins further. Behavior tightens. Spending slows. Commitments shorten. The culture becomes conservative in the literal sense. Protecting what remains. Protection replaces planning. Planning had assumed continuity. Protection assumes fragility. This assumption spreads quietly. No announcement is made. No threshold is crossed. But something changes. Waiting no longer feels safe. It feels risky. And when waiting becomes risky, the entire logic of boring history begins to fail. Because boring history depends on patience, on tolerance, on time smoothing conflict. When time stops smoothing, pressure begins to matter. What follows is not explosion, not revolution. It is reorientation. Slow at first, uneven, confusing. People test boundaries again. Institutions hesitate. Signals conflict. This is the most unstable phase, not because of action, but because of uncertainty about rules. The old rhythms no longer guarantee safety. The new ones are not yet established. History speeds up slightly. Not enough to feel dramatic. Enough to feel different. Those who notice early adjust first. Those who don't assume normal will return. Normal rarely returns unchanged. This is where boring history ends. Not with a bang, but with the quiet realization that waiting no longer works. Reorientation does not feel like choice. It feels like necessity disguised as adjustment. People do not say, "We are changing direction." They say, "This is what makes sense now." Language shifts first. Words like temporary quietly disappear. Words like sustainable quietly appear. Sustainable no longer means growth. It means survivable. Policies follow language. They aim to reduce exposure, to minimize dependency, to shorten feedback loops. Efficiency is redefined, not as speed, but as reliability under stress. This reframing allows action without admitting failure. Institutions test limited changes. Pilot programs. Localized authority. Selective decentralization. Nothing comprehensive. Nothing irreversible. Reversibility becomes a requirement. This slows reform, but it also reduces fear. People accept small changes because they do not threaten identity. Identity remains anchored in continuity. The system experiments quietly. Some adjustments work. Others fade without notice. There is no grand plan, only correction. Correction accumulates. Over time, patterns emerge. Certain regions adapt better. Certain sectors regain momentum. Not uniformly, not predictably. This unevenness creates new reference points. Success is no longer measured against the past, but against peers. Comparison returns. Comparison generates pressure. Pressure reintroduces ambition. but in a muted form. Ambition now seeks control, not dominance. Control over inputs. Control over timelines. Control over risk. Long chains are shortened. Dependencies localized where possible. Redundancy is reintroduced. Redundancy once felt wasteful. Now it feels prudent. The culture begins to respect preparation again. Not preparation for opportunity, but preparation for disruption. Disruption is no longer hypothetical. Education adapts once more. Resilience becomes a concept. Systems thinking replaces optimization. Students are taught to expect shocks, to absorb rather than avoid. This produces a different temperament. Less optimistic, more grounded. Groundedness has advantages. It tolerates complexity. It accepts trade-offs. But it also limits aspiration. The new generation does not dream big. They plan carefully. Careful planning rebuilds capacity slowly. Slow rebuilding restores confidence partially. Partially is enough. People do not need certainty. They need plausibility. Plausibility that effort matters again. As plausibility returns, participation changes character. Not mass mobilization. Targeted engagement. Local initiatives. Professional coalitions. Issue-specific coordination. This coordination is fragile but functional. It avoids ideology. It focuses on outcomes. Outcome orientation feels refreshing after decades of process. Institutions respond positively. They learn again. Cautiously. Authority relaxes slightly. Not by design, but by adaptation. Trust does not surge. It trickles. Trickle is sufficient. The system stabilizes into a new equilibrium. Not stronger than before. Not freer than before. Just more honest about limits. History will later debate whether this was recovery or accommodation. From within, it feels like breathing room. Breathing room allows continuation. Continuation is no longer boring in the same way. It contains alertness. Alertness replaces fatigue. Fatigue does not vanish. It recedes. The society learns a final lesson. Waiting is not a strategy. Adjustment is. This lesson is not celebrated. It is internalized. Internalization is how boring history ends and functional history begins. Not heroic. Not dramatic. Just different. And different, after a long period of drift, is enough. Breathing room does not bring celebration. It brings caution. People remember how thin stability became. They remember how easily waiting stopped working. So they do not rush. Momentum is treated gently. Pushed too hard, it could break. This restraint defines the new rhythm. Decision-making becomes quieter. Less performative. More internal. Announcements shrink. Implementation grows. This reverses an old habit. For years, visibility mattered more than result. Now result matters even if unseen. Unseen success feels unfamiliar. It requires trust in process rather than narrative. Trust grows slowly. Too slowly to notice day by day. But behavior shifts again. People invest a little more. Commit slightly longer. Plan one step further ahead. Not far. Just further than before. This modest extension of horizon is the clearest sign of recovery. Recovery is not growth. It is confidence without excitement. Excitement is still avoided. It feels irresponsible. The culture remains grounded. Hope is expressed carefully. Often indirectly. People say things like, "Let's see how it goes. That might work. It's worth trying." These phrases matter. They signal permission to act. Action resumes in small units. Departments. Communities. Networks. Large movements remain rare. They are no longer required. The system functions through accumulation again. Small wins stack. Mistakes are corrected earlier. Feedback loops shorten. Short loops reduce fear. Fear once slowed everything. Now it only cautions. Caution is healthy in moderation. Over time, memory adjusts. The long drift is not forgotten, but it is contextualized. It becomes reference, not destiny. People stop narrating decline constantly. They talk about tasks, deadlines, practical constraints. This normalization of effort marks a psychological turning point. History inside the moment never feels like history. It feels like routine. Routine returns. Not the hollow routine of maintenance, but the steady routine of work that matters. This routine is quieter than collapse, less dramatic than renewal. It will never trend. It will never inspire slogans. But it endures. Endurance, this time, is not resignation. It is choice informed by memory. The society does not become bold. It becomes deliberate. Deliberation slows spectacle. It deepens consequence. Years later, analysts may argue whether this was success or stagnation. The people living through it will not care. They will measure progress in predictability regained. Bills paid on time. Services functioning. Decisions sticking. These are not heroic metrics. They are human ones. Human systems rarely need perfection. They need reliability. Reliability restores dignity. Dignity stabilizes participation. Participation strengthens continuity. Continuity, this time, is not drift. It is direction without drama. History moves on like this more often than it moves through upheaval. Most eras are not remembered because nothing exploded. They are remembered because life quietly worked again. This is the end of the boring part. Not because things become exciting, but because boredom is no longer masking fragility. What remains is ordinary time. Ordinary time is where most lives are lived. And ordinary time, when protected, is enough. So the story slows here. Not to stop, but to repeat. Because repetition is how stability is maintained. And maintenance, after everything, is the most underrated achievement in history. Ordinary time does not announce itself. It settles. Days resemble each other again. Not because nothing happens, but because things happen within expectation. Expectation is calm. Calm reduces vigilance. Vigilance once protected survival. Now it relaxes into awareness. Awareness is lighter than fear. It allows rest. Rest returns gradually. Not sleep, but mental rest. People stop scanning for signals constantly. They trust patterns again. Patterns stabilize behavior. When behavior stabilizes, history slows. Slow history is not empty. It is quiet. Quiet does not mean absence. It means absence of urgency. Urgency had dominated for a long time. Its disappearance feels unfamiliar. People adjust. They rediscover routines without tension. Work without constant contingency. Planning without constant revision. These routines are modest. They do not promise greatness. They promise continuity. Continuity is underrated because it lacks narrative. Narratives require disruption. Continuity requires care. Care does not attract attention. It sustains systems. Sustained systems fade into background. That is their success. When systems work, people stop thinking about them. History retreats again. This retreat is not regression. It is relief. Relief allows memory to soften. The long period of waiting, of adjustment, of drift becomes something people reference less often. Not because it is forgotten, but because it no longer defines the present. Definition returns to daily life. Morning routines. Evening pauses. Unremarkable choices. These choices accumulate. Accumulation rebuilds trust quietly. Trust no longer needs explanation. It becomes habit. Habit is the final stabilizer. At this point, history becomes boring again in a different way. Not boring because nothing matters, but boring because nothing threatens. Threat once sharpened attention. Now attention relaxes. Relaxed attention drifts inward. People think less about systems and more about themselves. This inward focus is not selfish. It is natural after prolonged strain. Societies oscillate like this. Outward during crisis. Inward during recovery. Neither state is permanent. Time continues. Children grow without inheriting fear directly. They inherit caution, but not exhaustion. Exhaustion fades fastest when it is no longer reinforced. New generations do not carry old tension unless it is taught. Teaching changes too. Lessons emphasize balance, limits, sustainability, not triumph. Triumph belongs to short eras. Balance belongs to long ones. Long eras are rarely dramatic. They are lived, not narrated. This is where history usually rests. Between events. Between crises. Between ambitions. This in-between space is where most people exist. They wake up. They work. They wait less. They adjust less. Life becomes predictable enough to be boring again. And boring, after everything, is peace. So the story slows further. Not ending. Not beginning. Just continuing. Continuing quietly. Continuing without instruction. Continuing without urgency. And as it continues, it circles back. Because history never truly moves forward in a line. It loops. Quietly, gradually, patiently, just like this. Time does not stop when things become calm. It simply stops demanding attention. Calm periods are deceptive. They feel empty, but they are full of quiet decisions. During ordinary time, systems are not tested by crisis. They are shaped by habit. Habit is powerful. It reinforces what exists without asking why it exists. People follow routines because routines work well enough. Well enough becomes the new standard. This standard is not ambitious. It is comfortable. Comfort reduces friction. Reduced friction slows change. Slow change feels safe. Safety feels earned. Earned safety is defended. When proposals emerge that suggest improvement, they are measured against comfort. Improvement sounds good in theory, but discomfort sounds real. So improvement is postponed again, not rejected. Deferred. Deferral accumulates. Years pass inside deferral. Infrastructure ages quietly. Processes harden. Assumptions remain unchallenged. Nothing fails catastrophically. Things simply require more effort. People notice effort increasing, but they attribute it to complexity, to population, to modern life. Rarely to structure. Structure hides behind routine. As long as routines function, structure is invisible. This invisibility is stability's shadow. During this phase, leadership becomes managerial. Leaders are judged not by vision, but by smoothness. Smooth transitions. Smooth messaging. Smooth handovers. Sharp ideas feel disruptive. Disruption is associated with past instability. Memory still warns. So leaders learn to soften language. They frame change as continuation. Nothing is framed as new. Everything is framed as refinement. Refinement sounds harmless. Harmlessness is persuasive. Citizens adjust expectations once again. They do not demand progress. They demand reliability. Reliability is delivered through repetition. Repetition builds trust, but also rigidity. Rigidity does not resist gently. It resists passively. Attempts to innovate encounter delay. Delay drains energy. Energy drains interest. Interest moves elsewhere. Talented individuals seek impact outside institutions. Private ventures. Independent work. External systems. The core remains stable but less dynamic. Stability masks hollowing. Hollowing is slow. It cannot be seen from the outside. Statistics look acceptable. Reports look neutral. Indicators show balance. But lived experience feels heavier. People carry more individually. More responsibility. More contingency. Collective systems still exist, but personal buffers grow thicker. This is adaptation, not collapse. Adaptation preserves life but redistributes burden. Those with resources adapt easily. Those without adapt constantly. Constant adaptation is exhausting. Exhaustion returns, not as crisis, but as background noise. Background exhaustion does not mobilize. It numbs. Numbness is stable. History stretches here. Years compress into sameness. Later historians will summarize this era quickly. A paragraph, a footnote. But for those living inside it, it feels endless. This is the paradox of boring history. Short in records. Long in experience. And this is only the beginning of the next cycle. As the cycle continues, people begin to mistake endurance for strength. Endurance looks impressive from a distance. Things are still standing. Systems are still operating. Life continues, but endurance is not renewal. It is resistance to stopping. This difference matters. When endurance replaces renewal, maintenance becomes the primary activity. Maintenance is careful. Maintenance is repetitive. Maintenance avoids risk. Risk threatens what has already been preserved. So preservation becomes priority. Budgets reflect this shift. Funds are allocated to keep things running, not to imagine new directions. Every decision asks the same question. Will this disrupt stability? If the answer is unclear, the decision is delayed. Delay protects the present at the cost of the future. But the future is abstract. The present is immediate. Immediate needs always win. People sense this imbalance. But they lack language for it. They feel busy, yet unsatisfied. Progress feels stalled, but nothing feels broken enough to demand repair. This creates a peculiar emotional state. Not anger, not hope. Suspension. Life feels paused even though time moves forward. Suspension changes how people invest emotionally. They stop expecting institutions to inspire. They only expect them not to fail. Not failing becomes success. This low bar is surprisingly powerful. It allows systems to survive indefinitely without improving. Survival without improvement slowly erodes legitimacy. But erosion is quiet. No single moment marks the loss. It fades like sound over distance. Participation continues out of habit. Civic actions become ritualistic. Ritual without belief maintains form, not function. People attend meetings. They submit forms. They follow procedures. But their expectations are minimal. Minimal expectation reduces disappointment. Reduced disappointment reduces conflict. Conflict was once a driver of change. Now it feels unnecessary. The absence of conflict is praised as maturity. Maturity, in this context, means not asking difficult questions. Difficult questions complicate routines. Routines protect comfort. Comfort stabilizes daily life, but it narrows imagination. Imagination once pointed forward. Now it looks sideways. People compare themselves not to ideals, but to neighbors. As long as others are struggling too, the situation feels acceptable. Normalization spreads. This normalization has consequences. Talent adapts downward. Skills are used defensively. Creativity is applied to avoidance, not creation. Avoidance becomes intelligence. Those who avoid mistakes advance. Those who attempt change expose themselves. Exposure carries cost. So initiative becomes rare. When initiative disappears, systems lose internal momentum. They rely on external pressure to move. But external pressure is unpredictable. It cannot be planned around. So leaders prepare to absorb pressure, not respond to it. Absorption is passive strength. Passive strength lasts a long time. History often confuses this with resilience. Resilience recovers. Passive strength endures. Endurance without recovery leads to brittleness. Brittleness is invisible until stress concentrates. Stress does not arrive evenly. It targets weak points. Weak points are often hidden by years of adjustment. When pressure finally finds them, reaction is slow. Not because people are incapable, but because systems have forgotten urgency. Urgency is a muscle. Unused, it weakens. Relearning urgency is painful. People hesitate. They wait for instruction. They look for precedent. Precedent offers comfort but not always relevance. The world outside continues to evolve. New models appear elsewhere. Different approaches succeed. Comparison becomes unavoidable. At first, comparison feels academic. Later, it feels personal. Why does it work there and not here? This question lingers. Lingering questions disturb equilibrium. Equilibrium responds by reinforcing routine. Routine pushes questions aside. But questions do not disappear. They wait. Waiting questions are dangerous. They gather evidence. Evidence accumulates quietly. One day, the evidence outweighs habit. That day does not feel revolutionary. It feels obvious. People say, "This has been building for a while." They are right. But recognition arrives late. This is how the second phase deepens. Not through failure, but through realization delayed. And realization, once it settles, cannot be unseen. Realization changes the temperature of time. Days feel slightly heavier. Conversations pause a little longer. People are not alarmed. They are attentive. Attention is the first sign that routine has weakened. Small comments begin to circulate. Not slogans. Observations. Things take longer than they used to. Decisions feel safer than they are useful. We adjust, but we don't advance. These remarks are not accusations. They are measurements. Measurement invites comparison. Comparison invites judgment. Judgment remains private at first. Public language stays careful. Official narratives remain unchanged. But private language shifts. In private spaces, people speak more directly, less politely. Politeness had once smoothed frustration. Now it delays understanding. Understanding demands clarity. Clarity does not arrive suddenly. It arrives through repetition. The same issues appear in different departments, different communities, different professions. Patterns emerge. Patterns are harder to ignore than events. Events can be dismissed. Patterns cannot. This recognition produces discomfort, not fear. Unease. Unease motivates inquiry. People begin to ask how decisions are actually made, not how they are described. They trace processes backward. They notice loops, redundancies, points where responsibility dissolves. They discover that many systems are designed to prevent failure, not to enable success. This design made sense once. Now it constrains. Constraint feels tolerable until it blocks something desired. Desire has been muted for years. Now it reappears quietly. Not grand ambition. Practical desire. To do work efficiently. To see results. To feel progress. These desires are modest. That is why they are powerful. They do not threaten identity. They threaten inefficiency. Inefficiency has been normalized. Normalizing inefficiency allowed stability to persist. Now it irritates. Irritation spreads faster than hope. Hope demands imagination. Irritation demands relief. Relief seems achievable. People experiment locally. They bypass steps. They simplify processes. They coordinate informally. These experiments are small. They succeed quietly. Success spreads faster than policy. Others copy methods. Informal best practices emerge. This is not rebellion. It is adaptation with intention. Institutions notice the shift late. When they do, they face a choice. Formalize the changes or suppress them. Suppression risks morale. Formalization risks exposure. Exposure reveals inefficiency. Inefficiency challenges narratives. So institutions hesitate. Hesitation creates space. Space allows more informal solutions. Authority begins to fragment. Not break. Fragment. Fragmentation redistributes power. Those who understand processes gain influence. Those who control permission lose relevance. This is a subtle transfer. It does not appear in charts. It appears in who gets things done. Official roles remain. Unofficial roles grow. People learn where real momentum lives. This knowledge changes behavior. They invest less in formality. More in relationships. Networks strengthen. Strong networks accelerate coordination. Coordination reduces delay. Delay was the defining experience of the old system. Reducing delay feels revolutionary, even though nothing has officially changed. This is how transformation begins in boring history. Not with confrontation, but with competence. Competence exposes inefficiency without attacking authority. It simply works better. Better is persuasive. Persuasion does not require agreement. It requires evidence. Evidence accumulates again. This time, evidence favors action. The old equilibrium weakens further. It is not destroyed. It is outpaced. People stop waiting as much. Waiting had once felt safe. Now it feels wasteful. This emotional shift matters. Waste provokes response. Response builds momentum. Momentum is still fragile, but it exists. And once momentum exists, history begins to move a little faster. Not fast enough to excite. Fast enough to matter. This is the threshold. Beyond it, routine no longer dominates time. Time starts to feel directional again. Momentum attracts attention without asking for it. People begin to notice that certain things now move faster. Not everywhere, not always, but enough to be felt. This uneven movement creates contrast. Places where action flows stand beside places where delay still dominates. Contrast sharpens perception. Questions change again. Not, why does nothing work? But, why does this work here? This shift matters. When success appears possible, failure feels less acceptable. Local leaders take note. They do not announce change. They imitate it. Imitation spreads quietly. What was once informal becomes semi-official. What was once tolerated becomes encouraged. But encouragement remains careful. No one wants to admit that old systems were misaligned. So language stays neutral. Phrases like best practice, efficiency improvement, process alignment appear. These words allow adoption without confrontation. Confrontation would force accounting. Accounting would reveal cost. So change hides inside optimization. Optimization feels safe. As optimization spreads, structures adjust subtly. Approval chains shorten. Responsibility clarifies. Feedback loops tighten. Nothing revolutionary. Just fewer pauses. Fewer pauses compound. Time begins to feel lighter. People sense regained agency. They do not say it openly. They demonstrate it. They volunteer ideas again. They propose timelines. They expect response. Expectation returns cautiously. Cautious expectation is healthier than blind hope. Institutions respond unevenly. Some adapt, others resist. Resistance rarely announces itself. It manifests as delay. Delay remains the last defense of inertia. But now delay is visible. Visibility changes its effect. Once invisible, delay felt natural. Now it feels obstructive. Obstruction invites workaround. Workarounds multiply again, but now they are coordinated. Coordination challenges authority without confronting it. Authority senses erosion. To reassert relevance, it must choose. Support momentum or contain it. Containment risks appearing obstructive. Support risks losing control. Control has been central for a long time. But control without effectiveness is hollow. Hollowness is harder to hide once alternatives exist. Some leaders adapt. They shift from gatekeeping to facilitation. Facilitation feels like leadership without dominance. This change is significant. It redefines power as enabling rather than permitting. Enabling accelerates trust. Trust accelerates coordination. Coordination increases output. Output reinforces legitimacy. This cycle strengthens quickly once it starts. However, it remains uneven. Areas left behind feel tension. Comparison sharpens again. Why are some spaces improving while others remain stuck? This question introduces politics, not ideology. Distribution. Who benefits first? Who waits longer? Equity concerns emerge. Equity complicates momentum. Addressing it requires structure. Structure reintroduces delay. So the system hesitates again. This hesitation tests resilience. Can momentum survive without central clarity? Can local success scale without losing speed? These questions hover. No answers yet. But something important has changed. People now believe that movement is possible. Possibility alters tolerance. What once was endured is now challenged. Challenge remains polite, measured, persistent. This persistence is new. It does not seek rupture. It seeks continuation, but better. Better is a powerful demand. It cannot be ignored indefinitely. The system stands between two rhythms. The old rhythm of waiting. The new rhythm of movement. Both exist simultaneously. This coexistence is unstable. Sooner or later, one will dominate. History leans forward here. Not dramatically. Just enough. Tension does not rise suddenly. It thickens. Two rhythms now coexist. Movement in some places. Waiting in others. This unevenness creates friction. Friction is not loud. It is administrative. It appears in schedules that no longer align. In expectations that no longer match outcomes. People begin to feel misplacement. Not personally, but structurally. They ask where effort is best spent. Where action still matters. Where waiting has become pointless. These questions redirect energy. Energy flows toward momentum. Away from inertia. This redistribution weakens old centers of influence. Not because they fail, but because they lag. Lag becomes noticeable. Once noticeable, Lag demands explanation. Explanations repeat familiar language. Complexity. Constraints. Process. But these explanations now compete with visible counterexamples. Counterexamples are persuasive. They do not argue. They demonstrate. Demonstration changes standards. What once felt acceptable now feels inefficient. Inefficiency is no longer tolerated quietly. It is named gently, repeatedly. Naming creates pressure. Pressure forces decision. Leadership can no longer rely on neutrality. Neutrality begins to look like avoidance. Avoidance erodes credibility. Credibility had already thinned. Now it risks disappearance. Some leaders choose adaptation. Others retreat into formality. Formality slows everything. Slowness now carries cost. People circumvent formal paths. They coordinate directly. They prioritize results. This behavior is not rebellious. It is pragmatic. Pragmatism undermines rigid hierarchy. Hierarchy depends on patience. Patience has expired. Expired patience is dangerous. It does not protest. It disengages. Disengagement empties institutions without collapsing them. They still exist. They still operate. But they matter less. Meaning migrates. Meaning attaches to places where effort converts to outcome. This migration accelerates. Those left behind feel resentment. Not ideological resentment. Operational resentment. They see resources move away. Attention shift. Influence decline. This resentment introduces resistance. Resistance slows integration. Integration was the path to balance. Without integration, fragmentation deepens. Fragmentation is risky. It can produce innovation. It can also produce conflict. Conflict is still avoided. So fragmentation persists quietly. Quiet fragmentation is unstable. Everyone senses it. Conversations become careful again. Not from fear, but from calculation. People test language. They avoid commitments. They hedge positions. Hedging signals uncertainty. Uncertainty spreads upward. Decision makers face incomplete pictures. Signals conflict. Acting decisively risks error. Waiting risks irrelevance. This is the central dilemma. The system hesitates again. But hesitation now has consequence. Momentum does not pause politely. It moves elsewhere. Each delay reinforces decentralization. Central coordination weakens further. This weakness is structural, not intentional. No one chose it. It emerged. Emergence is difficult to reverse. At this point, history enters a narrowing corridor. Paths close quietly. Options reduce. The future becomes more defined, not by vision, but by momentum already in motion. People feel this narrowing. It creates urgency. Urgency does not shout. It focuses. Focused urgency changes behavior rapidly. Shortcuts become standard. Direct communication replaces protocol. Trust is reassigned. Reassignment of trust is reassignment of power. Power shifts again. This time, the shift is noticeable. Not dramatic, but undeniable. The old rhythm struggles to keep pace. The new rhythm accelerates slightly. Time itself seems to choose. And history, still boring, begins to lean decisively in one direction. By now, the shift no longer needs explanation. It is felt, not as crisis, as absence. The absence of response. The absence of coordination. The absence of confidence that decisions still originate from the center. People stop asking permission. Not out of defiance, but because permission takes too long. Delay has become the loudest signal. Where delay exists, initiative fills the gap. This initiative is informal at first. Temporary. Just for now. Temporary solutions have a habit of staying. They prove usefulness. They solve immediate problems. They attract reliance. Reliance builds quietly. Soon, systems exist parallel to official ones. Not designed. Accumulated. Parallel systems reduce pressure on formal institutions. This relief feels positive. But relief also reduces urgency for reform. Reform requires discomfort. Discomfort has been outsourced. The center becomes calmer. Less complaints. Fewer emergencies. Calm is misread as stability. Stability is announced. Announcements change behavior. People adjust expectations downward. They plan around limitations. They stop demanding more. Demand once created accountability. Now it fades. Accountability fades with it. Rules are still written. Reports are still filed. Meetings still occur. But outcomes drift. Drift is slow enough to avoid attention. Until accumulation becomes visible. Small inefficiencies align. Small delays synchronize. The system begins to miss moments. Opportunities pass unclaimed. Problems mature before response. Maturity makes problems heavier. Heavier problems require authority. Authority now feels symbolic. Symbols cannot move weight. Those holding formal power sense this mismatch. Some attempt enforcement. Enforcement without legitimacy creates friction. Friction exposes weakness. Others attempt reform again. Reform without leverage stalls. Stalling becomes routine. Routine dulls awareness. Dulled awareness is dangerous. Because by the time awareness returns, options are gone. Meanwhile, alternative structures solidify. They develop norms. They develop trust. They develop memory. Memory is critical. Memory allows continuity without permission. Continuity becomes independence. Independence is not declared. It is assumed. Assumed independence is difficult to challenge. Challenging it requires confrontation. Confrontation risks instability. Instability is still feared more than stagnation. So confrontation is avoided. Avoidance confirms separation. Now, coordination is optional. Optional coordination means selective participation. Selective participation weakens collective identity. Identity fragments. Fragmentation is no longer theoretical. It appears in language. We becomes they. Responsibility becomes conditional. Conditional responsibility breaks systems. Systems require predictability. Predictability is gone. At this stage, leadership speaks carefully. They emphasize unity. They call for patience. Patience is no longer persuasive. It sounds disconnected from experience. Experience now contradicts narrative. When narrative and experience diverge, experience wins. People align with what works. What works becomes normal. Normality reshapes expectation. Expectations rewrite legitimacy. Legitimacy has moved. Not officially. Practically. This movement is irreversible without disruption. Disruption is still postponed. Postponement is the final strategy. History recognizes this pattern. It is the moment when decline stops being reversible, even though nothing dramatic has happened. No collapse. No revolt. No final speech. Just a system that no longer directs its own future. The future is being decided elsewhere. Quietly. Efficiently. Without asking. And the center? Still standing, still operating, has become a witness. The system no longer speaks loudly. It hums quietly. A low, consistent vibration that fills the spaces where noise once lived. People notice less. They act more. Routine dominates. Not because life is simple, but because complexity has been absorbed slowly, patiently. The lessons of drift remain. Waiting is no longer safe. Adaptation is constant. Momentum is subtle. Momentum now defines limits. Limits define expectation. Expectation shapes behavior. Behavior becomes predictable. Predictability is not dullness. It is survival refined. Survival without collapse is the quietest achievement. People operate within new norms. They do not celebrate progress. They register it internally. They trust small improvements because history has shown waiting alone cannot protect them. Institutions are no longer symbols. They are tools. Functional, responsive, but restrained. Authority is quieter. It facilitates rather than directs. It acknowledges that the future will not bend to decrees. It adjusts, incrementally. The public, in turn, does not demand spectacle. They expect competence. They follow practical outcomes. They notice efficiency. They replicate it. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle. Small successes accumulate. Redundant delays are bypassed. Minor inefficiencies are corrected quietly. Trust returns, softly, but vigilance persists. Experience has taught patience and caution, and the cost of ignoring minor stress. Life settles into rhythm. Not dramatic, not heroic, not celebrated, just continuous. Continuous enough to allow rest. Quiet enough to allow reflection. Slow enough to observe small details. Reliable enough to maintain confidence. And yet, the system continues to evolve without fanfare. Incrementally. Predictably. Without collapse. History, in its boring way, teaches the longest lessons in silence. The events that go unnoticed shape the world most fundamentally. People understand this instinctively now. They participate quietly. They adjust continually. They plan for resilience. And so, after decades of drift, hesitation, and fragmented momentum, ordinary life endures. It hums. It repeats. It adapts. It survives. And in that survival lies the real story, not heroics, not upheaval, not collapse, just steady continuity, the quiet, patient heartbeat of history. Time moves on. The system remains. People continue. And the cycle, boring as it may seem, is enough. Enough to learn, enough to endure, enough to continue, quietly, steadily, indefinitely.